Introduction to the Vision of Columbus, a poem in 9 books by Joel Barlow, Part 3, 1787. The immediate consequence of this was a second voyage, in which Columbus took charge of a squadron of 17 ships of considerable burthen. Volunteers of all ranks and conditions solicited to be employed in this expedition. He carried over 1,500 persons, together with all the necessaries for establishing a colony and extending his discoveries. In this voyage he explored most of the West India Islands, but, on his arrival at Hispaniola, he found the garrison he had left there had been totally destroyed by the natives, and the fort demolished. He however proceeded in the planting of his colony, and, by his prudent and humane conduct towards the natives, he effectually established the Spanish authority in that island. But while he was thus laying the foundation of their future grandeur in South America, some discontented persons, who had returned from the colony to Spain, together with his former enemies in that kingdom, conspired to accomplish his ruin. They represented his conduct in such a light at court, as to create uneasiness and distrust in the jealous mind of Ferdinand, and made it necessary for Columbus again to return to Spain, in order to counteract their machinations, and to obtain such farther supplies as were necessary to his great political and benevolent purposes. On his arriving at court, and stating with his usual dignity and confidence the whole history of his transactions abroad, everything wore a favorable appearance. He was received with usual honors, and again solicited to take charge of another squadron, to carry out farther supplies, to pursue his discoveries, and in every respect to use his discretion in extending the Spanish Empire in the New Worlds. In this third voyage he discovered the continent of America at the mouth of the river Orinoco. He rectified many disorders in his government of Hispaniola which had happened in his absence, and everything was going on in a prosperous train, when an event was announced to him, which completed his own ruin, and gave a fatal turn to the Spanish policy and conduct in America. This was the arrival of Francis de Bobadilla, with a commission to supersede Columbus and his government, and with power to arraign him as a criminal, and to judge of his former administration. It seems that by this time the enemies of Columbus, despairing to complete his overthrow by groundless insinuations of malconduct, had taken the more effectual method of exciting the jealousy of their sovereigns. From the promising samples of gold and other valuable commodities brought from America, they took occasion to represent to the king and queen, that the prodigious wealth and extent of the countries he had discovered would soon throw such power into the hands of the viceroy, that he would trample on the royal authority and bid defiance to the Spanish power. These arguments were well calculated for the cold and suspicious temper of Ferdinand, and they must have had some effect upon the mind of Isabella. The consequence was the appointment of Bobadilla, who had been the inveterate enemy of Columbus, to take the government from his hands. This first tyrant of the Spanish nation in America began his administration by ordering Columbus to be put in chains on board a ship, and sending him prisoner to Spain. By relaxing all discipline he introduced disorder and licentiousness throughout the colony. He subjected the unhappy natives to a most miserable servitude, and apportioned them out in large numbers among his adherents. Under this severe treatment perished in a short time many thousands of those innocent people. Columbus was carried in his fetters to the Spanish court, where the king and queen either feigned or felt a sufficient regret at the conduct of Bobadilla towards this illustrious prisoner. He was not only released from confinement, but treated with all imaginable respect. But, although the king endeavored to expiate the offense by censuring and recalling Bobadilla, yet we may judge of his sincerity from his appointing Nicholas de Ovando, another bitter enemy of Columbus, to succeed in the government, and from his ever after refusing to reinstate Columbus, or to fulfill any of the conditions on which the discoveries were undertaken. After 2 years' solicitation for this or some other employment, he at length obtained a squadron of 4 small vessels to attempt new discoveries. He now set out, with the ardor and enthusiasm of a young adventurer, in quest of what was always his favorite object, a passage into the South Sea, by which he might sail to India. He touched at Hispaniola, where Ovando, the governor, refused him admittance on shore even to take shelter during a hurricane, the prognostics of which his experience had taught him to discern. By putting into a small creek, he rode out the storm, and then bore away for the continent. Several months, in the most boisterous season of the year, he spent in exploring the coast round the Gulf of Mexico, in hopes of finding the intended navigation to India. At length he was shipwrecked, and driven ashore on the island of Jamaica. His cup of calamity seemed now completely full. He was cast upon an island of savages, without provisions, without any vessel, and 30 leagues from any Spanish settlement. but the greatest providential misfortunes are capable of being embittered by the insults of our fellow creatures. A few of his hardy companions generously offered, in 2 Indian canoes, to attempt a voyage to Hispaniola, in hopes of obtaining a vessel for the relief of the unhappy crew. After suffering every extremity of danger and hardship, they arrived at the Spanish colony in 10 days. Ovando, through personal malice and jealousy of Columbus, after having detained these messengers 8 months, dispatched a vessel to Jamaica, in order to spy out the condition of Columbus and his crew, with positive instructions to the captain not to afford them any relief. This order was punctually executed. The captain approached the shore, delivered a letter of empty compliment from Ovando to the admiral, received his answer and returned. About 4 months afterwards a vessel came to their relief, and Columbus, worn out with fatigues and broken with misfortunes, returned for the last time to Spain. Here a new distress awaited him, which he considered as one of the greatest he had suffered in his whole life. This was the death of Queen Isabella, his last and greatest friend. He did not suddenly abandon himself to despair. He called upon the gratitude and justice of the king, and, in terms of dignity, demanded the fulfillment of his former contract. Notwithstanding his age and infirmities, he even solicited to be farther employed in extending the career of discovery, without a prospect of any other reward but the consciousness of doing good to mankind. But Ferdinand, cold, ungrateful and timid, dared not to comply with a single proposal of this kind, lest he should increase his own obligations to a man, whose services he thought it dangerous to reward. He therefore delayed and avoided any decision on those subjects, in hopes that the declining health of Columbus would soon rid the court of the remonstrances of a man whose extraordinary merit was, in their opinion, a sufficient occasion of destroying him. In this they were not disappointed. Columbus languished a short time, and gladly resigned a life, which had been worn out in the most effectual services perhaps that were ever rendered, by any human character, to an ungrateful world. Sometime in this gloomy interval, before his death, the vision is supposed to have been presented to him, in order to satisfy his benevolent mind, by unfolding to him the importance of his discoveries, in their extensive influence upon the interest and happiness of mankind, in the progress of society. The author has indulged a small anachronism in the opening of the poem, for the sake of grouping the misfortunes of the hero, as the time of his actual imprisonment was previous to his last voyage and to the death of Isabella. The author, at first, formed an idea of attempting a regular epic poem, on the discovery of America. But on examining the nature of that event, he found that the most brilliant subjects incident to such a plan would arise from the consequences of the discovery, and must be represented in vision. Indeed, to have made it a patriotic poem, by extending the subject to the settlement and revolutions of North America and their probable effect upon the future progress of society at large, would have protracted the vision to such a degree as to render it disproportionate to the rest of the work. To avoid an absurdity of this kind, which he supposed the critics would not pardon, he rejected the idea of a regular epic form, and has confined his plan to the train of events which might be represented to the hero in vision. This form he considers as the best that the nature of the subject would admit, and the regularity of the parts will appear by observing, that there is a single poetical design constantly kept in view, which is to gratify and soothe the desponding mind of the hero. It being the greatest possible reward of his services, and the only one that his situation would permit him to enjoy, to convince him that his labors had not been bestowed in vain, and that he was the author of such extensive happiness to the human race,